The following clip is from a book review and analysis video I made on Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. The book explores the idea that our society has been transformed into a Huxleyan, not Orwellian dystopia as a result of the television displacing the written word as our primary means of understanding ourselves. George Orwell wrote the famous novel 1984, which showcases a futuristic totalitarian surveillance state where people are controlled through force and fear. Big Brother, the state, watches and oppresses the people at all times. In the novel Brave New World, on the other hand, Aldous Huxley imagined that no such North Korean-style government would be necessary to oppress the future. Instead of people being controlled by force and fear, Huxley believed that people would be controlled by pleasure and entertainment. Truth and history would not be suppressed. They would simply be made irrelevant by titillating distractions. People would fall in love with technologies that would undo their capacity to think. Neil Postman argues that the television is the prime example of this technology. The following clip is an example of why Postman believes this is the case. Now we've come to this point in the section where we will discuss, the impact of TV advertisements and just, the medium of television on political discourse versus the way political discourse was conducted back in the days of Abraham Lincoln. Postman talks about the Lincoln-Douglas debates at a couple points during this book, and he remarks that those debates went on for hours and hours, like no commercial breaks, nothing like that. Just Lincoln and Douglas standing up on tree stumps in front of people in a town square and just debating. And he describes how people would sit there and they would listen to these lengthy responses. So let's go ahead and read the first passage regarding the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which comes on page 48. I choose the Lincoln-Douglas debates as a starting point for this chapter, not only because they were the preeminent example of political discourse in the mid-19th century, but also because they illustrate the power of topography to control the character of that discourse. Both the speakers and their audiences were habituated to a kind of oratory that may be described as literary. For all of the hoopla and socializing surrounding the event, the speakers had little to offer and the audiences little to expect but language. And the language that was offered was clearly modeled on the style of the written word. This next passage offers a great example of what I just read there of Postman. This is coming on page 46, and this just shows how topography, the way writing was done back in Lincoln's era, was the way speaking was done as well. And it made for some very impressive oratory skills in both Lincoln and Douglas and all the politicians of that time. I mean, it's a stark difference from today, as we shall see. In the second debate at Freeport, Illinois, Lincoln rose to answer Douglas in the following words. It will readily occur to you that I cannot, in half an hour, notice all the things that so able a man as Judge Douglas can say in an hour and a half. And I hope, therefore, if there be anything that he has said upon which you would like to hear something from me, but which I omit to comment upon, you will bear in mind that it would be expecting an impossibility for me to cover his whole ground. Now reading Postman's words yet again. It is hard to imagine the present occupant of the White House being capable of constructing such clauses in similar circumstances. And if he were, he would surely do so at the risk of burdening the comprehension or concentration of his audience. People of a television culture need plain language, both orally and visually, and will even go so far as to require it in some circumstances by law. The Gettysburg Address would probably have been largely incomprehensible to a 1985 audience. This point is just kind of obvious on its face. Like, can you imagine Donald Trump saying anything remotely like what Lincoln just said? What about Biden? I think Biden would make it through like the first half of the first quarter of the first sentence before he went,
we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing.
And it's important to keep in mind that like paragraph that Lincoln spoke, that was on a whim. And it's very clear, and this is Postman's point, that Lincoln was a reader. Like, he really could read. and that influenced the way he talked. Now let's talk about the presidential election that happened in 1984. This is something that Postman discusses on page 97, and let's just go ahead and read that. And yeah, the contrast between what happened in the 1994 presidential debate versus the Lincoln and Douglas debates, it's pretty clear on its face. Prior to the 1984 presidential elections, the two candidates confronted each other on television in what were called debates. These events were not in the least like the Lincoln-Douglas debates or anything else that goes by the name. Each candidate was given 5 minutes to address such questions as, what is or would be your policy in Central America? His opposite number was then given 1 minute for a rebuttal. In such circumstances, complexity, documentation, and logic can play no role, and indeed, on several occasions, syntax itself was abandoned entirely. It is no matter. The men were less concerned with giving arguments than with giving off impressions, which is what television does best. Post-debate commentary largely avoided any evaluation of the candidates' ideas, since there were none to evaluate. Instead, the debates were conceived as boxing matches, the relevant question being, who KO'd whom? The answer was determined by the style of the men, how they looked, fixed their gaze, smiled, and delivered one-liners. In the second debate, President Reagan got off a swell one-liner when asked a question about his age. The following day, several newspapers indicated that Ron had KO'd Fritz with his joke. Thus, the leader of the free world is chosen by the people in the age of television. Now let's move on to page 133, which kind of plays off of that passage I just read, and it kind of brings it all full circle to discussions surrounding the television commercial. The point is that television does not reveal who the best man is. In fact, television makes impossible the determination of who is better than whom. If we mean by better such things as more capable in negotiation, more imaginative in executive skill, more knowledgeable about international affairs, more understanding of the interrelations of economic systems, and so on. The reason has almost entirely to do with image. But not because politicians are preoccupied with presenting themselves in the best possible light. After all, who isn't? It is a rare and deeply disturbed person who does not wish to project a favorable image. But television gives image a bad name. For on television, the politician does not so much offer the audience an image of himself, as offer himself as an image of the audience. And therein lies one of the most powerful influences of the television commercial on political discourse. There's no product information that's really communicated in most commercials. It's just, man, I wish I could be like that. And Postman's point is the same rule applies for televised presidential debates. It's not about who's more capable as a president. It's not about who is more experienced. It's about who's handsomer or prettier. It's about who's more charismatic. And it's about who is the most quick-witted. It's all about image.